Every conversation carries a consequence. Every viewpoint searches for facts. Discovering your legal standing, delivering rightful justice.
Step out of the vehicle, ma'am.
Officer, I have not been drinking. I passed your test.
I smell marijuana. I'm searching the vehicle. You have
Turn
no
around.
probable cause. Turn around. You're under arrest.
I am a federal judge. This is a serious mistake.
Yeah, sure.
A federal judge sat calmly in her parked car, reviewing case files on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Within minutes, she'd be handcuffed, accused of a crime she didn't commit, by an officer who had no idea his body camera was about to capture the mistake that would cost him everything. This is the story of how one traffic stop exposed a pattern of racism that had been hiding in plain sight for years. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Officer Derek Hastings shifted his patrol car into park and watched the black Mercedes sedan idling in the far corner of the Riverside shopping plaza. 38 years old, with 12 years on the Millbrook Police Department, Hastings had what his supervisors called an aggressive approach to law enforcement. What the disciplinary files in his jacket called it was something else entirely. 3 formal complaints in 2 years, 2 involving allegations of racial profiling. All of them quietly swept under departmental review, resolved with mandatory sensitivity training that Hastings treated like a joke during coffee breaks. He'd been cruising through the plaza that Tuesday afternoon in March 2023, halfway through a shift that had been frustratingly uneventful, when he spotted the Mercedes. Tinted windows, engine running, a lone occupant behind the wheel in a parking spot facing away from the storefronts. To Hastings, it looked suspicious. Or maybe it just looked like an opportunity. His dashboard camera captured him picking up his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12. Running a check on a possible suspicious vehicle at Riverside Plaza, black Mercedes sedan, license plate." He squinted through his windshield, reading off the numbers. D'accord. What Hastings couldn't see through that tinted glass was Judge Claudia Brennan, 52 years old, one of the youngest federal judges appointed to the district bench in state history. She'd pulled into this parking lot 20 minutes earlier, not to shop, but to escape. Her morning had been consumed by a grueling sentencing hearing, a case involving police corruption that had left her mentally exhausted. She needed 15 minutes of silence before heading to her next appointment. So she'd parked in this quiet corner, turned on her seat warmers against the early spring chill, and opened the file for tomorrow's docket. Judge Brennan had grown up in the south side of Chicago, the daughter of a postal worker and a school teacher who taught her early that excellence was her only armor. She'd graduated top of her class at Howard University, then Harvard Law. Spent 8 years as a federal prosecutor with a conviction rate that made defense attorneys nervous. Her appointment to the bench 3 years ago had been celebrated, but it came with a weight she carried everywhere. Every decision scrutinized, every word measured. She couldn't afford mistakes. She was reading a motion to suppress evidence when she noticed the patrol car in her rearview mirror. The officer sat there for a moment, then his door opened. Judge Brennan felt a familiar tension creep into her shoulders, that heightened awareness that came from being a black woman in America, even when wearing a federal judgeship. She placed her reading glasses on the passenger seat and lowered her window halfway, letting in the cool March air. Hastings approached with his hand resting casually on his duty belt, his body cam already recording. The first words out of his mouth weren't, "Good afternoon," or, "Is everything all right?" They were, "License and registration, now." Judge Brennan kept her hands visible on the steering wheel. "Good afternoon, officer. May I ask why you've stopped me? I'm legally parked in a public lot." Hastings leaned down, peering into her car with an expression that managed to be both bored and contemptuous. "You've been sitting here with your engine running for 20 minutes. Looks like you're waiting for something, or maybe smoking something." He sniffed dramatically. "I smell marijuana coming from this vehicle." There was no marijuana. Judge Brennan didn't smoke, didn't drink beyond an occasional glass of wine. Her car smelled like leather cleaner and the vanilla air freshener hanging from her rearview mirror. But she'd sat in enough courtrooms to know that an officer's claim of smelling drugs was a magic phrase, a skeleton key that opened the door to searches, seizures, and worse. "Officer, I assure you there are no drugs in this vehicle. I'm simply taking a break between appointments." Hastings straightened up, his jaw tightening. "Step out of the car, ma'am. I need to conduct a search." "I don't consent to a search. I haven't committed any crime." "You got something to hide?" His voice took on an edge, that particular tone Judge Brennan had heard in hundreds of body cam videos played during suppression hearings, the tone that came right before things escalated. "Let me guess. You've probably got a record. That's why you're nervous, right? Let me run your information and see what pops up." Judge Brennan remained perfectly still. She could have ended this in 5 seconds by identifying herself. But something made her wait, a curiosity about just how far this would go, how far he would go. She handed over her driver's license and registration through the window, watching Hastings walk back to his patrol car. What happened in the next 3 minutes would later be described by the prosecution as a textbook example of racial profiling and abuse of power. Hastings ran her license, and the system returned exactly what it should have: a clean record, a home address in the city's most affluent neighborhood, and a notation that made his face go pale when he finally bothered to read it. But he didn't read it carefully enough. Or maybe he just didn't care. Because when he walked back to that Mercedes, he was already reaching for his handcuffs. If you believe that standing up for what's right can change everything, share this story and let others know that justice can prevail. Hastings came back to the Mercedes with a swagger that suggested he'd found exactly what he was looking for, even though he hadn't. Judge Brennan watched him approach in her side mirror, noting the subtle change in his body language. More aggressive now, more confident. His hand hovered near his pepper spray, as if she posed some kind of threat while sitting calmly in her own vehicle. "Ma'am, I need you to step out of the car right now." His voice carried that artificial authority some officers used when they wanted to remind you who held the power. "I've got reasonable suspicion that you're operating under the influence." Judge Brennan's eyebrows raised slightly. "Under the influence?" "Officer, my car is parked. The engine is running for heat, and I've been sitting here reviewing work documents." "That's not what it looks like to me." Hastings pulled the door handle, but it was locked. His face flushed. "Open this door now, or I'll charge you with obstruction." This was the moment. Judge Brennan had presided over countless cases where this exact scenario played out. An officer making demands without legal justification, a citizen caught between compliance and constitutional rights. The difference was, she knew the law better than Hastings ever would. But she also knew something he didn't, something her father had told her when she was 16 years old, after she'd gotten her driver's license. "Baby girl, when you're pulled over, your law degree won't stop a bullet. Your judgeship won't stop a baton. You stay alive first. You fight back later in the courtroom where you have the advantage." She unlocked the door. Hastings yanked it open with more force than necessary. "Step out. Hands where I can see them." Judge Brennan moved slowly, deliberately, keeping her hands visible as she emerged from the vehicle. She stood there in her tailored navy suit, her courthouse ID badge still clipped to her lapel, though Hastings didn't bother to look at it. He was too busy running his eyes over her car's interior, searching for anything he could use to justify what he'd already decided to do. "You got any weapons on you? Any needles? Anything that's going to poke me or hurt me?" "No, officer, nothing like that." "Turn around. Hands behind your back." Judge Brennan's pulse quickened, but her voice remained steady. "Officer, I need you to explain what crime you believe I've committed. You have no probable cause to detain me." Hastings grabbed her wrist, twisting it behind her back with enough force to make her wince. "The crime is you running your mouth when I'm trying to conduct an investigation. That's obstruction right there." The handcuffs clicked into place. Too tight. Judge Brennan had seen enough unlawful arrest videos to recognize the unnecessary use of force, the slight extra pressure on the cuffs, the way he pushed her forward against the car when there was no need. These weren't the actions of an officer conducting a lawful investigation. These were the actions of a man who'd done this before and gotten away with it. "What's your badge number?" Judge Brennan asked, her cheek pressed against the cool metal of her car's roof. "You'll find out soon enough when you're sitting in lockup." Hastings leaned in closer, and she could smell the coffee on his breath mixed with something else. Anger, satisfaction, the scent of a man enjoying his authority a little too much. "You people always think you're special. Think the rules don't apply to you. Got your fancy car, probably bought with drug money or welfare fraud. There it was. The racism that had been simmering under the surface now bubbling up without filter. Judge Brennan had heard worse in her lifetime, had endured slurs and assumptions since childhood, but hearing it from someone sworn to protect and serve carried a particular sting. Not because it hurt her feelings, she was long past that, but because she knew this man had been doing this to others. How many people had he terrorized? How many had he arrested on false pretenses? How many lives had he disrupted because they had the wrong skin color in his jurisdiction? Officer, I'm going to ask you one more time to check my identification thoroughly. Look at my driver's license again. Hastings laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. Oh, I checked it, sweetheart. Claudia Brennan, 32 Oak Ridge Drive, probably your dealer's address, right? Or maybe your baby daddy bought you that Mercedes with his rap money. A small crowd had started to gather in the parking lot. A woman with shopping bags had her phone out recording. An elderly couple stood by their sedan, watching with concern. A teenage employee from the nearby coffee shop had paused mid-trash run, his eyes wide. This wasn't happening in a dark alley or an empty road. This was happening in broad daylight, in a busy shopping plaza, in full view of witnesses and Hastings' own body camera. Judge Brennan made a decision. She'd given him enough chances to correct course, enough opportunities to realize his mistake. Now she needed to protect herself and create a record of what was happening. My name is Claudia Brennan. I'm a federal judge for the Northern District. The identification you're holding should indicate this in the system notes. I've committed no crime. You have no probable cause for this detention, and everything you're doing right now is being recorded on your body camera as an unlawful arrest. For just a second, maybe two, Hastings froze, his grip on her arm loosened slightly, but then his face hardened again, and Judge Brennan recognized the look. It was the expression of a man who'd gone too far to back down, who'd rather double down on a mistake than admit he'd made one. A judge? He snorted. Right, and I'm the Pope. You know how many people try that line with me? I'm a lawyer, I'm a doctor, I know the mayor. It never works. He pulled her away from the car. You're under arrest for obstruction of justice and suspicion of operating under the influence. You have the right to remain silent, though I'm guessing you won't use it. The woman with the phone called out, Officer, she just said she's a judge. Maybe you should check. Hastings spun around. Ma'am, step back or you'll be arrested for interfering with police business. The woman didn't step back. She kept recording. So did two other people now, their phones held high, capturing every moment. This was 2023, and everyone knew the power of video evidence. These witnesses understood they might be documenting something important, something that needed to be seen. Hastings shoved Judge Brennan toward his patrol car, his hand on the back of her head as he pushed her into the back seat. The cage smelled like sweat and fear, the scent of everyone who'd sat there before her, guilty and innocent alike. Through the metal grating, she could see Hastings talking into his radio, his free hand gesturing angrily. He was calling for backup, requesting a K-9 unit to search her vehicle, spinning a narrative of a combative suspect who'd resisted lawful orders. Judge Brennan sat in that cage, her hands cuffed behind her back, her shoulders aching, and thought about the irony. She'd spent years on the bench listening to defense attorneys argue that their clients had been racially profiled, unlawfully detained, subjected to excessive force. She'd reviewed countless body cam videos, weighing credibility, searching for truth in the space between what officers claimed and what the evidence showed. She'd sent officers back to work with qualified immunity and sent defendants to prison based on those same officers' testimony. Now, she was on the other side of that equation, and her body camera was recording every single second of it. If you believe that accountability matters no matter who wears the badge, share this story and let the truth be heard. The backup arrived within 8 minutes. 2 additional patrol cars pulled into the Riverside shopping plaza, their lights painting the afternoon in alternating blue and red. Judge Brennan watched through the cruiser's window as Officers Martinez and Chen stepped out, their expressions shifting from routine response to visible confusion as they took in the scene. A well-dressed black woman in the back of Hastings' car, A growing crowd of witnesses with phones raised, Hastings himself, animated and aggressive, already talking before his colleagues were fully out of their vehicles. Subject was acting suspicious, engine running for extended period, refused to comply with lawful orders, claimed to smell like marijuana. Hastings rattled off his justification like he'd rehearsed it, but Martinez wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the Mercedes, at the scattered case files visible through the open driver's door, at the woman in the back seat who sat with the posture of someone accustomed to authority, not someone high or drunk or guilty of anything. Officer Chen approached Hastings' vehicle and leaned down to look through the window. His eyes met Judge Brennan's, and she saw the exact moment recognition flickered across his face. He straightened up fast, walked quickly back to Hastings, and said something too quiet for the body camera to pick up clearly. But the microphone caught Hastings' response perfectly. "I don't care what she says she is. I know what I saw. I know what I smelled." Martinez had moved to the Mercedes now, and she was looking at something on the passenger seat. Judge Brennan's courthouse ID badge had fallen there when she'd removed it, along with her reading glasses. Martinez picked it up, held it to the light, and her face went pale. She turned to Hastings with an expression that was equal parts disbelief and alarm. "Derek, you need to see this, right now." But Hastings was too deep in his own narrative, too committed to the story he'd started telling. He waved Martinez off. "I've got this under control. Call for the K9 unit like I asked. We're searching this vehicle." "Derek." Martinez's voice carried an edge now, sharp enough to cut through his stubbornness. She held up the badge. "She's not lying. This is a federal courthouse ID. Judge Claudia Brennan, Northern District." The parking lot went quiet. Even the witnesses seemed to hold their breath, sensing that something significant had just shifted. Hastings stood frozen, the badge in Martinez's hand catching the afternoon sun. Chen had pulled out his phone and was frantically typing, probably searching for Judge Brennan's photo to confirm what they all suddenly feared was true. Judge Brennan watched Hastings' face cycle through emotions. Disbelief first, then a flicker of fear, then something uglier, a desperate attempt to maintain control of a situation that was rapidly spiraling away from him. He snatched the badge from Martinez and stared at it like it might transform into something else if he looked hard enough. "Anyone can get a fake ID made," he said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "This doesn't prove anything." Chen turned his phone around, showing a screen that displayed Judge Brennan's official judiciary photo alongside her biography. Appointed 2020, previously served as assistant U.S. attorney. Harvard Law School graduate. The words seemed to hover in the air between them, damning and irrefutable. "Oh, God," Chen whispered. "Derek, what did you do?" That's when Hastings made his second major mistake of the day. Instead of immediately releasing Judge Brennan, instead of apologizing and trying to salvage what little he could from this disaster, he doubled down. "She still could have been doing something illegal. I had reasonable suspicion. I followed procedure." Martinez looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "You arrested a federal judge for sitting in her own car, in a public parking lot, without probable cause." "I smelled marijuana." "There's no marijuana." Martinez had walked around the Mercedes, looking through the windows. "There's files, and a briefcase and a coffee cup. That's it. Derek, you need to let her out right now and pray she doesn't file charges." But it was too late for that. Judge Brennan had already decided how this would play out. She'd given Hastings multiple opportunities to course correct, multiple chances to recognize his error and stop digging himself deeper. He'd refused every one. Now she would do what she'd been trained to do, what she'd spent her entire career doing. She would let the system work exactly as it was designed to work, with one crucial difference. This time, she wouldn't be the one holding the gavel. Hastings opened the back door of his cruiser, and Judge Brennan stepped out, still handcuffed. Her wrists had started to bruise where the metal had bitten into her skin, visible marks that would photograph well in evidence documentation. She turned around, without being asked, waiting while Hastings fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking slightly as he unlocked the cuffs. The metal released with a click, and Judge Brennan rubbed her wrist slowly, deliberately, making sure the body cameras caught every detail of the injury. When she finally spoke, her voice carried across the parking lot with perfect clarity. "Officer Hastings, I need your full name and badge number. I also need the names and badge numbers of every officer present. Martinez stepped forward quickly. Your Honor, I'm Officer Sarah Martinez, badge number 2847. This is Officer James Chen, badge number 3012. We responded to a backup call. We weren't involved in the initial stop. Noted. Judge Brennan's eyes moved to Hastings, who stood there looking like a man watching his career implode in real time. And you, officer? Derek Hastings, badge 1634. The words came out barely above a whisper. Officer Hastings, you detained me without probable cause, subjected me to an unlawful search, arrested me without justification, used excessive force during that arrest, and made multiple racist statements throughout this encounter, all of which was captured on your body camera and by multiple witnesses. She gestured to the crowd, to the phone still recording. I will be filing a formal complaint with your department. I will be requesting a full investigation by Internal Affairs, and I will be forwarding this matter to the U.S. Attorney's Office for potential federal civil rights violations. Hastings tried to speak, but nothing came out. Chen had his hand over his mouth, looking like he might be sick. Martinez just shook her head slowly, the universal gesture of someone watching a preventable tragedy unfold. Judge Brennan collected her belongings from the Mercedes, her hands steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her system. The case files, her briefcase, her phone that had 14 missed calls from her clerk who'd probably been trying to reach her about this afternoon's emergency motion hearing that she was now going to be late for. She checked her watch. 43 minutes had passed since Hastings first approached her vehicle. 43 minutes that would cost him everything. As she started her car, Martinez approached her window. Your Honor, I'm so sorry this happened. We're not all... I know you're not all like him, Officer Martinez. Judge Brennan's voice softened slightly. But the ones who are like him keep getting away with it because good officers stay quiet. That ends today. She drove out of that parking lot with Hastings still standing there, surrounded by witnesses and his colleagues and the wreckage of his own making. The woman who'd been recording approached him, her phone still raised, and asked a question that would later be played millions of times online. Officer, how does it feel knowing you just arrested a federal judge for being black in a parking lot? Hastings had no answer. There was no answer that could fix what he'd done, no words that could undo the last hour, no explanation that would justify his actions to the review board that would soon be dissecting every second of his body cam footage. By the time Judge Brennan reached the courthouse, the first news alert had already hit social media. Someone in the crowd had uploaded their video with a caption that would trend for weeks. Racist cop arrests federal judge, doesn't believe she's a judge, keeps harassing her anyway. The video had been viewed 10,000 times in the first hour. By evening, it would be 10 million. Judge Brennan walked into her chambers, set down her briefcase, and called her clerk. Cancel this afternoon's hearings. I need you to contact the U.S. Attorney's Office. Tell them I'm coming in tomorrow morning with video evidence of a civil rights violation, and they're going to want to see it before it goes viral tonight. Then she sat down at her desk, rolled up her sleeves to photograph the bruises on her wrists, and began documenting everything that had happened, every word, every action, every racist comment. Not because she was angry, though she had every right to be, but because this was bigger than her wounded pride or her afternoon interrupted. This was about every person who'd sat in that cage before her without a law degree or a judgeship to protect them. Every person who'd been profiled, harassed, arrested, and had no recourse because their word against an officer's was never enough. Officer Derek Hastings had made a mistake, and Judge Claudia Brennan was going to make sure he answered for it. If you believe that justice should be blind but accountability should be crystal clear, share this story and let everyone know that the badge doesn't put you above the law. The video hit 10 million views by midnight. By morning, it had 30 million. News outlets from CNN to local stations picked up the story, and suddenly everyone had an opinion about what happened in that Riverside Shopping Plaza parking lot. But opinions didn't matter anymore. Evidence did. And there was so much evidence that even the most aggressive defense attorney couldn't spin it into anything resembling justified police work. The Millbrook Police Department tried to get ahead of the story. Chief Raymond Porter held a press conference 36 hours after the incident, standing behind a podium with the department seal, promising a thorough investigation and speaking in careful, rehearsed language about accountability and community trust. But his words rang hollow when a reporter asked why Officer Hastings was still on paid administrative leave instead of fired, and the chief could only mumble something about due process and union contracts. What the chief didn't mention was what had happened in the closed-door meeting that morning. Judge Brennan had arrived at the U.S. Attorney's Office at 9 a.m. Sharp with her attorney, Marcus Webb, a civil rights specialist who'd made his career dismantling police misconduct cases. They'd brought 3 thumb drives. One contained the full body camera footage from Hastings' camera, obtained through an emergency judicial order. The second contained footage from Officers Martinez and Chen, which corroborated every detail of Judge Brennan's account. The third contained 17 videos filmed by witnesses, each one showing a slightly different angle of the same appalling behavior. Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Larson had sat through the footage once, then immediately watched it again, taking notes. When the videos ended, she looked at Judge Brennan with something between sympathy and fury and said 5 words that changed everything. "We're taking this case federal." The investigation moved with unusual speed. The FBI got involved within a week, not just examining the Brennan incident, but diving deep into Hastings' 12-year career. What they found was damning. 43 complaints filed against him over the years. 43. Most had been dismissed after cursory internal reviews. But when FBI agents started interviewing the complainants again, patterns emerged. Nearly all were people of color. Nearly all described the same behavior, the same racist language, the same aggressive tactics. Several had been arrested on charges that were later dropped. 2 had been physically injured during encounters with Hastings. One man, a schoolteacher named Robert Chen, had spent 3 days in jail on fabricated drug charges before a public defender got the case thrown out due to lack of evidence. The media discovered Robert's story and ran with it. Suddenly, this wasn't just about a judge being harassed. It was about a system that had protected a racist officer for over a decade while he terrorized an entire community. Protests erupted outside the Millbrook Police Department. City council members called for the chief's resignation. The mayor, facing re-election in 6 months, promised sweeping reforms and an independent investigation into the entire department. 3 weeks after the incident, Officer Derek Hastings was formally terminated from the Millbrook Police Department. No paid leave, no severance, just a termination letter citing gross misconduct, abuse of authority, and conduct unbecoming an officer. His police union initially protested, but even they went quiet when the full body cam footage leaked online and the public outcry became too loud to ignore. But Judge Brennan wasn't finished. She'd told Martinez that day in the parking lot that this would end, and she meant it. The federal charges came down 2 months later. United States of America v. Derek Hastings. Deprivation of rights under color of law, a civil rights violation that carried serious prison time if convicted. The indictment was 13 pages long and methodical in its detail, describing not just what happened to Judge Brennan, but establishing a pattern of behavior that showed Hastings had systematically targeted people based on race throughout his career. The trial lasted 6 days. The prosecution presented the body camera footage on the first day, playing all 43 minutes of it in the hushed courtroom. Jurors watched Hastings approach Judge Brennan's car. They heard every word he said, every racist assumption, every unlawful order. They saw him handcuff her despite her calm compliance. They heard him mock her when she identified herself as a judge. When the video ended, several jurors were visibly upset. One woman in the back row was crying. Hastings's defense attorney, a weary public defender named Thomas Garrett, who'd been stuck with a case no private lawyer wanted to touch, tried his best. He argued that Hastings had made an honest mistake, that he genuinely believed Judge Brennan was behaving suspiciously, that his comments were unprofessional but not criminal. But the evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution brought in Robert Chen, who testified about his own arrest by Hastings 3 years earlier. They brought in Maria Gonzalez, who described being pulled over 6 times in 2 years by the same officer, always with accusations of drug possession that never resulted in charges. They brought in expert witnesses who analyzed the body cam footage and testified that nothing Judge Brennan did constituted suspicious behavior or justified detention. And then Judge Brennan took the stand. She sat in the witness box wearing the same Navy suit she'd worn that day, and she walked the jury through every moment of the encounter, not with anger or drama, but with the precise, measured tone of someone presenting evidence. She described the fear she'd felt when Hastings grabbed her wrist, the humiliation of being shoved into a cage like a criminal, the bruises that had lasted for 2 weeks. And then she said something that would be quoted in newspapers across the country. "I have the benefit of education, resources, and a position that commands respect. I had those advantages, and I was still powerless in that moment. I think about all the people Officer Hastings encountered who didn't have those advantages, who couldn't fight back, who had no recourse when he violated their rights. This case isn't just about what happened to me. It's about what's been happening to our communities for years while people looked the other way." The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. Sentencing came 3 weeks later in a different courthouse before a different judge because Judge Brennan had recused herself from any involvement in determining Hastings' punishment. Federal Judge William Morrison, a 72-year-old veteran of the bench known for his strict but fair sentences, reviewed the pre-sentencing report with the kind of careful attention that had defined his 30-year career. The report detailed everything: Hastings' history, the pattern of abuse, the lives he'd disrupted, the trust he'd destroyed. When Judge Morrison finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of disappointment. "Mr. Hastings, you were given a badge and a gun and the public's trust. You were sworn to protect and serve all members of your community equally. Instead, you used your authority as a weapon against the very people you were supposed to protect. You terrorized innocent citizens. You violated their constitutional rights repeatedly and systematically. And when finally confronted by someone with the knowledge and standing to challenge you, you doubled down rather than admit your mistake." The courtroom was packed. Judge Brennan sat in the gallery, flanked by Marcus Webb and several of Hastings' other victims who'd come to witness this moment. News cameras lined the hallway outside, waiting for the sentence that everyone knew would send a message. "The sentencing guidelines suggest a range of 37 to 46 months. Judge Morrison continued, "But this court finds that an upward departure is warranted given the egregious nature of your conduct and the need for deterrence. Mr. Hastings, you are hereby sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release." The gasp that went through the courtroom was audible. 8 years. It was more than anyone had expected, more than even the prosecution had asked for. But Judge Morrison wasn't finished. "Let this sentence serve as notice to every law enforcement officer in this district and beyond. The badge does not grant you immunity from the law. It grants you responsibility to uphold it. When you violate that responsibility, when you use your authority to deprive citizens of their constitutional rights, you will be held accountable to the fullest extent possible." Hastings stood there, his face drained of color, his hands trembling as a U.S. Marshal moved forward to take him into custody. No more uniform, no more badge, just an orange jumpsuit and 8 years to think about the choices that had brought him to this moment. Judge Brennan watched as they led him away. She felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory. What she felt was exhaustion mixed with a grim kind of relief. Relief that it was over. Relief that at least this time the system had worked the way it was supposed to. But she also knew that for every Derek Hastings who got caught, there were others still out there, still abusing their authority, still terrorizing communities with impunity. The press conference afterward was held on the courthouse steps. Judge Brennan stood with Marcus Webb, with Robert Chen and Maria Gonzalez, and 3 other victims who'd found the courage to come forward once Hastings was charged. She made a brief statement, carefully worded, aware that her position required a certain decorum even in the face of personal violation. Today's sentence represents accountability, but it also represents a beginning. We must examine the systems that allowed Officer Hastings to abuse his authority for 12 years. We must ask why so many complaints were dismissed, why warning signs were ignored, why victims weren't believed. Real change requires more than punishing one officer. It requires reforming the structures that enable this kind of misconduct. A reporter shouted a question. "Your Honor, do you think 8 years is enough?" Judge Brennan paused, choosing her words carefully. No sentence can undo the harm caused to the people Officer Hastings victimized. But this sentence sends a clear message that civil rights violations will be prosecuted vigorously and punished severely. That's an important message for our community and for law enforcement across this country. The video of that press conference was viewed 12 million times in 2 days. It sparked conversations in police academies, in law schools, in city councils, and state legislatures. Several departments around the country implemented new training protocols. 3 states passed legislation requiring independent review of police misconduct complaints. It wasn't revolutionary change, but it was movement in the right direction. Judge Brennan returned to her courtroom the following week. She had a full docket, cases backed up from the weeks she'd taken off to deal with the trial and its aftermath. But something had shifted in her approach to the bench. She listened more carefully now when defense attorneys raised allegations of police misconduct. She scrutinized body camera footage with fresh eyes. She asked harder questions during suppression hearings. And when she saw patterns of behavior that reminded her of Derek Hastings, she didn't hesitate to call them out. 6 months later, the city of Millbrook settled a civil lawsuit filed by Judge Brennan for $1.2 million. Money she immediately donated to organizations fighting police brutality and supporting victims of misconduct. The police department implemented sweeping reforms, including mandatory bias training, early warning systems to flag officers with multiple complaints, and an independent civilian review board with actual authority to investigate and discipline officers. Officer Derek Hastings began serving his sentence at a federal correctional facility 300 miles away. His appeal was denied. His request for early release was denied. He would serve at least 85% of his sentence, nearly 7 years behind bars, living in the same kind of cage he'd put so many others in. And every day, somewhere in America, the video of that March afternoon still circulated. New viewers discovered it, watched a racist cop harass a federal judge, watched him double down even after learning the truth, watched the consequences of his actions play out in real time. The video had become a teaching tool, a cautionary tale, a reminder that accountability was possible, even when it seemed impossible. Judge Claudia Brennan kept that video saved on her computer. Not to watch it, she had no desire to relive that afternoon, but to remember how it felt to be powerless, despite all her power, to remember the fear and anger and determination she'd felt sitting in that cage, to remember why she'd chosen this career, why justice mattered, why the law had to apply equally to everyone, including those sworn to enforce it. On the 1-year anniversary of the incident, Judge Brennan received a letter. It came from Robert Chen, the schoolteacher who'd testified at Hastings' trial. He wrote about how seeing her case had given him the courage to speak up about what happened to him, how he'd spent years thinking no one would believe him, how watching someone with her authority stand up to abuse had changed something fundamental in how he saw justice. The letter ended with a simple thank you and a promise that he was now volunteering with a local organization that helped people file complaints against police misconduct. Judge Brennan folded that letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer, next to the commendations and awards she'd received over the years. But that letter meant more than any of those official recognitions. It meant that what happened in that parking lot, as terrible as it was, had created something larger than revenge or punishment. It had created hope. Hope that speaking up mattered, hope that the system could work, hope that change was possible. Because in the end, that's what the story was really about. Not revenge or vindication, but the simple, radical idea that no one was above the law, not even those who wore the badge. And when someone finally stood up and demanded accountability, when the evidence was clear and the will was strong, justice could prevail. Derek Hastings would spend the next 7 years understanding that lesson from behind bars. And every officer who watched his case unfold, who saw the body camera footage and read the verdict and heard about the 8-year sentence, would have to ask themselves a question. Was the abuse of power worth it? Was the momentary satisfaction of wielding authority over someone worth losing everything? For Hastings, the answer had cost him his freedom, his career, and his reputation. For Judge Brennan, the answer had always been clear. The law wasn't just words on paper or rulings from a bench. It was the promise that every person, regardless of their race or status or position, deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. And when that promise was broken, there had to be consequences. Real consequences, lasting consequences, the kind that sent a message loud enough that everyone could hear it. If you believe that standing up for what's right can change everything, share this story and let others know that justice can prevail.
Justice requires constant vigilance, and credible information is your best defense. Thank you for watching and fostering a transparent society.